Can we find some way to protect our troops on military bases here at home? Let's bring in Texas Congressman Michael McCaul, chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. And here in studio, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, who's on the Armed Services Committee. Chairman McCaul, any new information on why Specialist Lopez went on this rampage, and do you see any lapses in the way the military had handled Lopez?
Let me say first, as a Texan, this tragedy hits hard, hits home, right in my backyard. My heart goes out to the victims and their families, and the community of Fort Hood has responded very bravely, resilient, and we are thinking about them at this critical point in time. Can we stop this in the future? I don't think you can ever 100% secure a military base from something like this happen. But I do think it requires a review, reanalysis of the force protection policies that we have at our military installations to see how can we better secure them. We also need to look at the possibility of whether we can hire more military police at these installations. Because, Chris, over the past 5 years, we've seen an uptick in violence at military installations. We have the Navy Yard example recently in Washington involving a mentally ill patient. Fort Hood, as you know, this is the second time. First time by Major Hassan, a terrorist. Now this time by a mentally ill patient. With respect to the details, we do know that he was applying for leave to possibly, I think his mother just passed away, and he was looking for a leave of absence. Perhaps he was disgruntled about that, but that's not a rational response to go ahead and shoot 16 and kill 3 others, and then including himself. I think this requires us to look at whether or not also we should be looking at the idea of senior leadership at these bases, give them the ability to carry weapons. They defend us overseas and abroad and defend our freedom abroad. So the idea that they're defenseless when they come on home on our bases, I think the Congress should be looking at that and having a discussion with the bases about what would be the best policy.
You've given us a lot to chew on, and before I bring in Senator Kaine, I want to point out that there have been about a dozen of these terrible tragedies, shootings, over the last 5 years, and I want to put up on the screen some of the worst cases. You mentioned November 2009, Major Nidal Hassan kills 13 in a terror attack at Fort Hood. March 2013, Sergeant Eusebio Lopez kills 2 Marines in Quantico, Virginia. September 2013, former sailor Aaron Alexis, driven by delusions, kills 12 in the Washington Navy Yard. And then Wednesday, Lopez kills 3 and wounds 16 at Fort Hood. Some of these were political terror attacks. Some of these were personal grudges. Some of them were obviously cases of mental illness. Do you see any common thread, and do you see any common solution?
Well, Chris, I'll start with where Mike started. Very, horrible thing when you hear about this. We all are connected to the military in many ways. In Virginia, there was a shooting at the Norfolk Naval Base about 2 weeks ago that was not on the screen. So we're really feeling this. Common threads, let's look at a couple. One, some of the recent shootings, there's always an element from the outside world coming onto the base. The 2 Fort Hood shootings were guns purchased out in the community that were brought on in this instance this week against regulation, the gun that was used. The shooting at the Navy Yard here was a contractor who was working, and there were some questions about should that contractor have had access. At the naval base in Norfolk, it was a transportation worker who got to the base and wrestled somebody's gun away. So
what are you suggesting? Tighten the perimeter?
Perimeter security is probably a place that we definitely should look. Mental health, we should look. When the shooting this week is of somebody who was, seeking mental health assistance, there were some postings overnight about Facebook postings that were kind of strange. We need to look at that and the nexus that's complicated between mental health laws and gun laws. And then the last thing is, we do need to acknowledge that our military, after 13 years of war, that's a stress. It's been 13 years of war, repeated deployments. We in Congress shouldn't stress them further. I think we've stressed them further with things like sequester and budgetary moves that have deprived them of the certainty that they need.
Well, wait, let me ask you that question.
Yeah.
Would you vote to raise the Pentagon budget then, as a Democrat?
Depending on the line item, sure. I mean, I'm not no blank checks. We shouldn't be doing blank checks. But when we're requiring them to do across-the-board cuts, we do have to look at the effect of those cuts on mental health services or the effect of those cuts on base security. So we should be, as Mike said, we've got to be having a conversation about, okay, these trends happen, what can we learn, how can we fix them?
Well, Congressman McCall brought up the question of guns, and let's focus on that a little bit, because one of the things that I was surprised to learn that this week is that guns are more tightly restricted and regulated on military bases than they are in the civilian world. Let's put up some of those. Soldiers are prohibited from carrying guns on base unless it's a specific duty they have, and they must register the guns. And this week, Army Chief of Staff General Ray Odierno stood by that policy based on the belief that troop disputes are more of a threat than the rare mass shooting. Take a look.
We have our military police and others that are armed, and I believe that's appropriate. I think that I believe that allows us the level of protection necessary.
Chairman McCall, you've been talking this week about arming more soldiers to protect themselves and take down a shooter like Lopez. You're disagreeing with General Odierno here.
Well, look, I think the best way to do it would be to have more military police on our bases, but the fact is the president's budget takes us back to World War II levels, so I don't see an increase in that kind of funding, although, as the senator said, we should be looking at that. I think a way to have a force multiplier here is to maybe look at the idea, a common sense idea of senior leadership at these bases, officers and enlisted men that you can trust who have defended us abroad, the idea that they could at least carry a weapon on the base, because when these things happen, this was responded to very quickly, but it doesn't take very long to wound and kill a large number of people. And I think that that would be a deterrent, number one, and number two, a way to have a quick response to any sort of shooter that's come on these bases. This is, again, the second time I've seen this now at Fort Hood.
Let me bring Senator Kaine in. Should more soldiers be able to carry their own guns on base?
Well, Chris, I trust the military's leadership on this. I don't live on a military base and I don't serve in the military. And for those of us in Congress to say, here's what they should do, I worry that it would be a little political rather than really about safety or security. The military should reassess, everything they do on the security. And if they conclude, now these bases already have about as many weapons per capita as any place in terms of people carrying weapons as part of their duty on bases. That happens. You just can't carry a personal weapon. You can keep it in your personal a home on a base. You can't carry it, but there are duty weapons everywhere. But look, if the military reassesses and says that's the right strategy, then I'm going to support them. But I think stopping these at the gate is probably the place that we should most focus our attention.
You've got 100,000 people that are going in and out. You can't. It's not like an airport with a metal detector.
That's very true. I mean, Fort Hood is a huge base. I mean,
right.
I think there's maybe 1,000 active and another 10 or 15,000 civilian plus contractors. So it is something that you have to have a balance there. But I do think in mental health and perimeter security,
let me bring in mental health, because that issue is the one other thing I want to get to before we have to let you go. Recent studies suggest that as many as 30% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans come back with emotional or behavioral problems. An average of 7 to 9 active duty or veterans commit suicide every day. Senator Kaine, it's easy to talk about this in hindsight, but you mentioned earlier, and I want to put up on the screen the Facebook post that Ivan Lopez had put up, in fact, on March 1st, the same day that he bought the gun that he ended up using in all these shootings. My spiritual peace has all gone away. I am full of hate. I believe now the devil is taking me. Question, should the soldiers' actions and words have set off alarms?
I think they should have. And you read those and your heart sinks, both because maybe we missed something, but also because of, again, 13 years of war, repeated deployments, whatever his particular situation. We have put this military under a stress they've never been under before. And we have to own the responsibility for providing the resources. And Chris, the last thing I'll say is this. While the instances of mental health are severe, we shouldn't walk away leaving the impression that our folks in active service or our veterans are just a bruised and wounded bunch. Look at the instances of heroism. Danny Ferguson, who stood in front of a door to protect the lives of others, or Petty Officer Mayo, who was killed in Norfolk a couple weeks back, who protected others. You know, our military is a resilient bunch of fantastic leaders. These are aberrations, and we need to solve them, but we shouldn't let them color our view of the way we see our military.
Chairman McCall, less than 30 seconds. Should their alarm bells have gone off given this fellow's treatment and his website postings, or is that just sort of 20 hindsight?
Well, it could be 2020. I think that's something the investigation is going to look at. Flags may have gone up. Let me just say the suicide rate is twice as high in the military as it is in the general population. We're good at healing broken bodies, but not as good at healing broken minds. I'm supporting a bill out there that has basically when people enlist in the military, there's a physical check, but there's not a mental health evaluation when people enter the service. I think this would be a good idea to, number one, screen out individuals that may have mental illness problems. Number two, have a baseline so that when they return home, we can compare that to where they are when they come back. And I think that would go a long ways with this mental health issue.
Chairman McCall, Senator Kaine, we want to thank you both. Thanks so much for coming in today. We will follow this closely. Thank you, gentlemen. What do you think?